There were a couple other Module 6 RAP quiz questions that some teams missed. One was 31, and this is an interesting one. We see much lower union labor much lower rates of unionization among the U.S. workforce compared to Canada's. And so the text had an interesting discussion of why that is. And it turns out that Europe and Canada were going through a lot of the same external forces that the U.S. was during the period, say, post-World War II period that we're talking about. We saw the U.S. saw a shift from manufacturing to service industries, and unions are more prevalent in manufacturing than in services, but that shift happened in Europe and Canada just as it did in the U.S. So since that happened in all three places, we can't really look to that as resulting in so much lower union participation in the U.S. compared to Europe and Canada. The U.S. legal environment that makes it relatively more difficult for unions to form and expand. Okay, well, that's something unique to the U.S., so that's looking pretty good right now. Let's just see if we can rule out C and D. The force of globalization and increased competition for foreign producers. Canada and Europe have opened themselves to trade right along with the United States, so that globalization is certainly a force in the U.S., but it's also a force in Europe and Canada. A reduced desire for unions because the workplace protection laws now that are now in place. Well, if anything, Europe and Canada have more protections for workers than the U.S. does. They certainly don't have less, and that wouldn't explain it. So we're left with B as the last question standing, and indeed B is the right answer to this one. Then this last one, how did Gary Becker suggest that competitive markets would reduce labor market discrimination? So this is from the reading. What did Gary Becker actually say? Consumer boycotts of companies that discriminate could change the policies of those companies. Yeah, one would expect that to be true, but that's not what Gary Becker wrote about. So you have to know this from the reading is the bottom line. Consumers are more willing to buy the products of companies that do not discriminate. Well, actually, you could have ruled these two out even without the reading because they say the same thing. And so this would either be a challengeable question or, because it has two right answers, or those A and B are both wrong. So you could have ruled that out, again, without doing the reading. But that kind of cleverness is not how most of us approach these multiple choice tests. But it's not a bad idea if you got nothing else. Companies that do not discriminate could hire more women and minorities and increase profits. Let's come back to that. That's looking pretty good, but let's see what the fourth one says. The greater information available in competitive markets could expose companies that discriminate. Okay, that may be true, but not. Actually, many firms, many buyers. I guess in that perfect information assumption, we get some effect like this, but that's not what Gary Becker wrote about. Gary Becker wrote about this idea that, hey, if minorities and women are discriminated against and they're not hired by many firms in the workforce, well, we'd expect to see that in a lower demand for their services, given their productivity, and that would result in higher wages for women and minorities. So if I'm not biased and I want to make money, I want to make profits, I notice that there are these perfectly good workers who are just as skilled, maybe more skilled than workers that I'd have to pay a lot for, that are part of male and white subgroup of the population. I have to overpay them relative to hiring women and minorities. I'm going to hire those women and minorities. I get just as good at workers, but for less money, and that's going to make me more profit because I'm going to have the same level of output per worker, but I'm going to have to pay my workers more. And if a lot of firms started acting that way, even if we had some firms that were prejudiced, what we'd see, though, if a lot of firms were not prejudiced, we'd see the wages of women and minorities bid up. As more people fought to hire them because their wages were low, well, then they'd have to offer them higher and higher amounts of money to get them to work for my company instead of the other 10 companies that are trying to hire them because their wages are lower than white male wages, and this process would continue until there was no difference, is the idea. Interestingly, I mentioned this to one group. Alan Greenspan has written before he was the chairman of the Federal Reserve from, gosh, forever, the 80s until the 2000s. Anyway, he used to run an economics consulting group in the 60s, I think. And he noticed that women economists were just as good as men economists, but they tended to be paid, significantly less. And he said he just made a practice of hiring only women because he could make more money that way. And so, he wasn't trying to promote women's wages or gender equity or anything. He was just looking for a bargain. And in doing so, if a lot of companies are acting that way, the wages of women will be bid up to the point where there's no advantage by hiring them instead of males, or hiring, same argument would go for hiring African Americans or Hispanics or Asian economists, whatever. So that's the idea that Gary Becker wrote about. We see some signs of that in the workforce, but certainly there's some other signs that suggest discrimination persists. My favorite study that suggests discrimination persists is a study that was very clever. It was one of those studies that you wish you had thought of. These researchers made up all these resumes. They were all fake, but they made up all these resumes that were carefully calibrated to have very similar qualifications. But the only difference was that some of the resumes were like from Emily Smith and, Prescott Harrington Bascom III. I'm making these names up, but apparently they're very white-sounding names was the idea here. And then the other group was, Lakeisha Johnson and, I'm not very good at this, but black-sounding names. The researchers calibrated them with focus groups, etc. What they found was that the resumes for the white-sounding names that were carefully controlled to be just as qualified or exactly the same in terms of the qualifications as the others, the resumes for the African-American sounding people, they got callbacks they got calls and requests for interviews at a much, much higher rate. Like, I don't know, I don't have the study in front of me. It's been years since I read it, but I want to say like 3 or 4 times as frequently as the resumes from African-American sounding people. And so this is clear evidence that there's some active discrimination going on in that critical stage of who firms are going to actually hire for jobs that are open.